Yeah, thank you everybody for dealing with the tech issues that we had. My name is Braden Muldook. I'm the director here at the Center for Theology and the Natural Sciences at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California. I'm very pleased to have Cyrus Olsen with us today, Cyrus Olsen III. Get to know Cyrus through a project that we're doing funded by the Templeton Foundation called Virtuous AI with a question mark, Cultural Evolution, Artificial Intelligence, and Virtue. So Cyrus has been working with doctors and religious studies scholars for several years now on these questions. So I'm anxious to see how the thought has developed since the conferences we had online last summer. Cyrus is an associate professor of theology and religious studies and health humanities at the University of Scranton, as well as an affiliate research fellow at Harvard Medical School through the Don Lab and its subsidiary, the Human Network Initiative, for a multi-year grant running through 2026 through the Templeton World Charity Foundation called Buffering Porosity and Brain Health in Uganda. Additionally, he is a research fellow for the nonprofit AI and Faith and has served previously on the Lo Shiavo Chair in Catholic Social Thought through Lane Center at the University of San Francisco, academic year 2022-2023. Let's welcome Cyrus.
Thank you, Braden. Yeah, great to be here and appreciate you welcoming me and the GTU here. And I have a friend with me as well, Mark, who you'll see in some of the slides related to the work. I'll say thanks to others in a minute. Okay, so excellent. Thank you, everybody, for being here, and especially thanks to Braden for the invitation, and to Mark for being here with me, Mark Graves, who you'll hear about in a moment as well, and friends from the GTU, both in person and online. So this is a project that comes out of, as Braden said, our work together that started in 23, and I can't believe it's not been, it seems like it's been ages since we did it, but it's only been a year really. So that was, as you'll see, funded by the John Templeton Foundation. That's a QR code for you if you want to get a hold of me and some of my work, and Braden already introduced some of the content. So thanks to the GTU and for this context. What I'm going to do is extend really a bit of the work that we did together here and show you how it relates to what I'm doing in Uganda. So that's the idea for the. So I was encouraged in the past when I was in graduate studies to honor somebody when I do my work. And so this is to, we're going to honor Father Tom Sable, who got his PhD from the GTU, who I worked with at Scranton for many years and is now passed away. But he was an old friend and ran the Center for Eastern Christian Studies, did the radio station for jazz and all kinds of music, and a wonderful person, but with a history to the GTU. So a nod to him and to Scranton as a consequence of those relationships. I'll also thank Erin Brigham, who's at USF. I worked with her in 22-23, and also a GTU grad, and Mark Graves, a GTU grad, all friends of mine now, and helped me work out my time here in San Francisco, especially. So it's great to be back in the Bay Area in summertime for San Francisco. So this is to Cynthia at Westmont College, the Lilly Network, where I just was this weekend. I wanted you to see this. So the Lilly Network of church-related colleges and universities hosted a conference at Westmont. And we had some data from the Springtide Research Institute concerning college students' perceptions of the value of their education. And I just want you to see here at the bottom, this is a nod for Braden to understanding religion and science as at least 30% of their concerns somewhere down on the list in terms of what's most important. But you do see up there is learning to think critically. But I thought it was quite interesting that at least religion and science ended up on the list and is important for the center here and the ongoing work that we're doing together. So, and a nod to Westmont, which is wonderful to be on the campus, my first time to Santa Barbara, so it was lovely. Again, this comes out of our work initially funded by the John Templeton Foundation. This is actually available online. So we recorded the lectures, Braden did, and they're all available for you. That's the QR code for them on YouTube. And what we did is we shared the papers in advance, and then we had collaborators present to respond. So the presentation is quite short. Some of the stuff that's in there will be here as well. But you can also see my collaborators from Norway, from San Diego, and the UK that are also involved in this paper and this work that I've been doing together. It's a collection really of ER physicians and anesthesiologists who are in conversation with me about these kinds of themes. So I couldn't do it without their efforts and their work as well. So if you want to see some other related content, I've done this for the graduate program in biomedical sciences at our local medical school, where actually the conversation amongst those folks that I just listed, we have a recorded YouTube video about scarcity of medical resources in this context to educate medical students. And so it's an ongoing conversation for us from work we've done together, even in Zermatt. That's me in the bag there at Air Zermatt doing a little photo shoot. So for fun, for the ECMO machine that's there on the left. Apparently in
in the photo shoot that, and the one that was actually used, I disappear entirely, and all you have is my shoe. So it was not exactly, it didn't come out well in the photo shoot. But these guys are all involved in emergency medical care around the world, and portable ECMO machines and things we can talk about that are relevant to prudential judgment in medicine and AI. Mark is here, and out of this also then resulted other kinds of projects with AI from Braden's encouragement and Mark's encouragement for, as you see, theology and science hosted out of this center here, and a nod to the Golden Gate Bridge there. But the collaborations have led to some productive work together, and as we'll talk about this, we're hoping that some of the work that we've done will also be published in the Journal for Religious Ethics, but we're waiting on that. We'll see. So it's been very generative, though, to be involved in these conversations together around AI, theology, and religious studies. You'll see that some of the work with AI and faith, with which Mark and I are involved in, is important here. There's a QR code for that, and you can see a nod to my years when I was working with my father, who's on this call, at Microsoft back in, I think that's a picture from 24 years ago. So, so I do have some roots back in the Seattle area to tech, to just give some bona fides for some of the work. As we'll see, we're going to extend this into Uganda, and some of those brains and motorcycles will make sense in a minute when we talk about it. And if you'd like, there's a QR code to some of the thought behind this from a piece I did for Church Life Journal out of Notre Dame that deals with some of the topics from the Templeton Foundation grants that we have here that you'll hear more about. So to go back to where this originated, and it's an ongoing project, right, Braden? I mean, you're still in the midst of that. It's a multi-year project, and so it's still ongoing, but wrapping up. And the question there is the title is Virtuous AI, Artificial Intelligence, Culture, Evolution, and Virtue, which seeks to explore these three themes, which you can see on the website that we dealt with. As you'll see, mine is related primarily to number 2, though you can't avoid addressing the others as you proceed. So really, if you think about and focus our attention initially on where this situates with respect to the initial grant, is can AI assist humans in the acquisition of virtue? The focus is on prudence in the context of medicine, so that we're clear about where we're at. And the basic idea is that, in my mind, in our minds, medical professionals are made more virtuous by augmenting their own work with AI. So that's just an easy way to situate yourselves and think about the main point, really, in these initial slides about what we can think about with respect to cooperation with AI and prudential judgment. Just to get a quick sense of prudence in this context from the tradition that would be indebted to Aristotle and forward in terms of virtue ethics, you see there the Greek that's used to deliberate well, really is what prudence is concerned with. And its end game is happiness or human flourishing. So that's the larger context for all of us to think about. Am I making good decisions, and are those good decisions leading me to the good life? And how might we then think about that in the context of medicine? It's a large task, and it's maybe too much for the usual practitioner simply to handle, but it fits with this larger philosophical and ethical framework for us about prudential judgment, which those of you who are more in the weeds here know that it's much more about practical judgment, so phronesis, than it is about larger wisdom. Locally here in the Bay Area, right, you have these contexts for weighing these issues at places like the Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence Institute at Stanford, in conjunction with Stanford Medicine, where they are concerned with using AI safely and equitably in health. And that's the end game, right, for us, is to find a way to make sure that we're able to use our resources to create such conditions socially for the use of AI in the context of medicine. I want you to see this in terms of the larger conversation about science and religion and where we all might land. So I myself am not a trained scientist. If you're thinking in terms of this three-dimensional box here as to where people belong with respect to practicing science, right? Are we traditional scientists? Are we communicating publicly? Might we be hackers or makers in the maker space? And I'm sitting somewhere close to the scientists. I belong to a lab, science lab, a clinical neurology lab, and I work with scientists, but I'm a bit on the edges even of this inner box, engaged much more in the public communication of science, and trying to find a way to be in dialogue within this three-dimensional cube about where you belong in the practice of science itself. Mark, are you seeing my screens overlaid over the box? So sorry about that. That should be, but you can't see the three-dimensionality of the box. So sorry about that before. So I know that you see the reach, epistemic focus, normative focus with respect to science communication. And so I think what we're doing is working together at finding our place within this larger context of how it is to, as we'll see, translate science and medicine in our work with one another. And that fits here within that translational science spectrum, where you see that there's basic research intertwined with clinical implementation, clinical research, public health, and so forth. So the patient hopefully is involved in all these and is in some way looked after and cared for well, though we know that's not always the case. But that's the dream and the hope, is that there's a sharing in the process of taking basic scientific research here in the core of the science box out into the public and into the practice of medicine, but it's an ongoing conversation at all levels, from people who are writing grants to policy to make that happen. And in the context for us of thinking about this, we really do need to be mindful of the sheer amount of information available to us. So if science and medicine are wedded today in what would be considered evidence-based medicine, then medicine has to be practiced from the latest evidence. But you see here from Tübingen, the landscape of biomedical research, and this is, I think, a little bit old now, is 21 million scientific papers and ongoing. Can any human person possibly crunch all of this and do anything with this for themselves, even in something you see here in acute stroke, which will be important to us momentarily, as you'll see, as just one among millions of papers that I then have to find a way to root my practice in, all the while keeping up on other clinical standards as well, right? So it's a tall order to really practice evidence-based medicine today in a context where information is just too much. And so maybe AI augmenting in that context, even for the latest research, might be assistive and help us make better decisions and keep medicine evidence-based, but reasonably so for practitioners. Those of you unfamiliar with where AI in healthcare fits right now, we're in basically AI 3.0. Okay, so you have symbolic AI and probabilistic models, deep learning, and now foundation models, where some of the concerns and strengths are listed for us, right? Where we can generate new content, we can include text, sound, and images, and have that into our integrated into our data sets and models. But there are also problems with overfitting and bias and other difficulties we have here that are a real problem for the practice of medicine. So that's where some of the work in Uganda will come into play. That right now we know there's a dearth of data and information from the global south, especially sub-Saharan Africa, that skews our data and skews our practice of medicine from the evidence. And so we need to partner better in the terms of the UN SDGs, like SDG 17, partnership for the goals and sustainable development goals, working with one another to mitigate those things like biases that are present in data sets in use in medicine. So the context, again, to think about equitable, safe health in this context might be software as a medical device. That's where we sort of honed in on a use case that's a bit closer and easier to get a hold of, right? That if you think about the way that AI is used in medicine today, that this is a way to package it and think about it, right? And so if you're really getting into the brass tacks about what we're talking about, it's an important place to look at. So SAMDs, as they're called, in the context of clinical decision support, is a way to further narrow what it is that we're talking about. Reminding ourselves that, again, we're in this context of prudence as a deliberation about what makes one happy, in the context of medicine, where domain-specific practices can be complemented by traditions of discernment in pursuit of the common good. So how can we do this well together in this soup of millions of points of data so that we can have AI-enabled medical devices that are, as we say, clinical decision support systems? They're already in use in medicine at all levels, in some places more heavily than in others. The question is, how can we ensure that use is sound, equitable, dialed into our ethical and even religious concerns, whose voices are included in the data sets that are in use? And as we'll see, some of the new data on, or at least a call for data on public health and religion is relevant here in the context of the CTNS. Again, medical professionals become more virtuous through augmented prudential judgments in situations like radiology. Okay, so one of the specialists that we worked with, who's publishing with us out of Norway, works in radiology especially, and has worked in radiology and AI. And it's a place that's really booming, even with respect to patents in the US, right? Companies that are patenting different ways to be able to package and sell to medical companies and medical practitioners technology that crunches images well and enables you to be a better diagnostician. Okay. And again, stroke will make more sense in a minute as to why we're focusing on that. And the other area, as you already saw, was ECMO, which is what my friend Zach Shiner does. And this is his podcast, ED ECMO, where some of these conversations in emergency medicine and what one can do with AI-enabled technologies for diagnostics under conditions, especially where you're dealing with patients who aren't conscious and may not be able to communicate. Are there ways that we can move in a direction where we have more information, more data, even from the patient, in such a way that if they're unconscious, we can get that, which might be relevant to something we'll talk about momentarily, such as the quantified self. So what we think of here is a dream that, and here you see a little image of the social bit, which I'll explain comes out of the Dahan lab, of a kind of care and diagnostics that would allow even our technology to be reading and understanding components of a person's navigation of their health in ways that are ignored right now in contemporary medicine. So what diagnostic tools are in use? And that's where I think you'll see the Ugandan material will come into play. So I'll give you an example. That social bit is actually the name of a technology that's in use through the lab to which I belong, the Dahan lab. And this is one of their studies, right? That's a wearable sensor that helps stroke patients them measure whether or not a stroke patient has interaction that helps their neuroplasticity and their recovery. So a difficulty that stroke patients have is that depending upon their condition is that isolation seems to happen quickly, and isolation further harms the person, even in the hospital setting. And so there is this attempt to understand that isolation and to study the ways that interaction can be beneficial through ambient sound, right? And that's, they have NIH permission to do this, and it's protected for the privacy of the patient. And so they're working at this in Cambridge to try to understand how that machine learning behind this, the algorithms can really assist them in understanding patient care under conditions of, frequently great isolation and duress, when we know that they need greater belonging and healing through relationships, including conversation from caregivers within the hospital setting itself. A person, if you don't know about it, his work that's really helpful here in thinking about prudential judgment in the context of what's called algorithmic governance is the work of Paul Schertz. Here's a nod to Solomon upon the wisdom seat making the judgment about the one woman who rolls over a child in the night and swaps it with the other, and Solomon has to make a decision pre-DNA evidence. How do I make a judgment that's forensic under conditions of little evidence? And the famous scene where he says, well, let's just slice the child in half, hence the sword here. And the mother says no, and the other mother says yes, and he knows who it is, right? So prudential judgment, Solomon is an ancient religious figure who's uplifted in that context as exemplary for judgments and virtue. But Paul Schertz reminds us that judgment should be understood as complemented by quantitative analysis, but not determined by it. In the contemporary period, we're tempted to allow quantification to determine our decisions, but not to be just one among many components about how we judge well. And so it's his sort of his concern and his warning for us in the context of an algorithmic age, as it were. And here are just images of things you might know about the quantified self, the way that we use wearables and all kinds of other tech on ourselves to measure our own performance, our own diet, and how long we use our phone. And so to inform our health and the other concerns that come out of the algorithmic justice league that you see there, about bias, and especially in the United States, racial bias in terms of data sets, and relevant also then to the work in the global South. So that we need to be careful about how the quantified self is applied in the context of clinical care, and mindful for ourselves that maybe sometimes we're also too ready to share that modes of quantification that may or may not help the diagnostics in medicine itself. We're also under conditions of the new cloud empires, as it's called, Amazon, Meta, Apple, Google, right? And who has control over server farms, and who can actually house the data that's used for large language models, and not to mention the ecological concerns about where these server farms are. And we can talk later if you want at the end. I lived in the Orkney Islands, where I know Microsoft sinks some of their servers into the North Sea in order to cool them. and this has knock-on effects to the ecology even of the North Sea. And our work in Africa is relevant to this kind of concern, that we need to be careful about not marginalizing voices further, and we should be available to imagine ourselves otherwise by incorporating voices that are left out of data sets, particular gender biases that are frequently in play for us. There's a relevance here to data governance and questions we can address otherwise in another time, maybe in the call and response at the end. So again, Paul's work, here's another quote that's important for us. Decision theory based in risk analysis should cease to be a complete model of decision-making and become what its most sophisticated practitioners already view it as, an aid to prudence in a restricted domain of decisions. Okay, so we restrict our domain, we understand it has its role, but we don't give it full reign and allow decision-making to be fully handed over to AI, but allow it to be augmented by our own judgments, and thus increase our capacity to make good judgments towards the end of happiness. I noted this at the beginning. There is a call now to include spirituality and religion as a social determinant of health. And you see here, it's a Harvard Public Health opinion, but it certainly is the case that even like the lab that I'm working at out of Cambridge and with Harvard Medical School is doing this kind of work, right? Understanding that not only in Cambridge, but also in Uganda, it's important to keep in mind people's religious convictions. And then this really helps you also not just understand convictions, but behavior, how people navigate their health, so that our tools of care and diagnostics are sounder, right, clearer, and dialed into our patient populations. So here's what Cynthia's been waiting for, some information on the work in Uganda. This is our work with the Templeton World Charity Foundation, buffering porosity and brain health in Uganda, which I'll explain here as we proceed in a QR code for you with my director, Ian Corbin, at the Brigham and Women's Hospital. If you'd like a background to this, I'll have a QR code for you for this at the end. Person I really owe this work to is Scott Kellerman, who is an adjunct professor at USF, but this piece is recently published in The Plow that tells us about a shared path to healing that is foundational to my work, and he invited me into this work that's led to collaboration with hospitals all over Uganda, including the hospital that he founded in the Southwest, incorporating traditional healers, traditional medical practices, and the way that folks in Uganda navigate their health. Similarly, if you'd like to take a look, my two collaborators on the grant, Ian and Amr Dahand, recently published this piece on the problem of loneliness, and we'll address that again in a minute, and what this looks like from the perspective of a neurologist and a philosopher who are in dialogue with me as a religious studies scholar in the context of not only Cambridge, but also now as we're extending that work into Uganda. Okay. Has to do with world building and how we share our worlds with one another, and the sociality of our belonging that are foundational. Again, our context, just to remind you, is prudence for the sake of furthering our happiness and making good decisions together. So we're trying to see how it is that people in Uganda seek health, so their health-seeking behavior. And this is what Anthony Balcom out of South Africa calls the socio-spiritual matrix. Not just our usual understanding of a measurable matrix that we think about in terms of the quantified self, but maybe even the quantified self could include, if we do it carefully, orientations to ancestors, to spiritual traditions, and that influence, as we know in Uganda, health-seeking behavior, and then allow the practitioners in places like sub-Saharan Africa to make better decisions about the patients they see, without the usual pattern, which is now people hide what they do, might be ashamed of what they do, and don't tell the practitioners what they're doing before they arrive, and delay their care, which in the context of the work that we do, which is out of a stroke lab, is very dangerous, right? So time is brain in stroke health. This is Amr Dahan's lab, is a stroke lab, works in clinical neurology, and this is one of their studies where they extend their expertise in neurology into social science and do social network analytics to figure out who in your network helps you, or maybe counterintuitively, somebody you might think would be a hindrance actually is a help. So a stranger or a neighbor or somebody who doesn't see you frequently. And this is an example of some of their modeling in terms of social science language of strong ties and weak ties, who's close to you, who's not, but still within your social network, who may influence what you do when you become ill. What we're doing is trying to figure out, are we leaving things out, right? what kinds of components of a person's social network might be in play that influence health, right? That also have their roots in religious traditions, as we know, in places like Uganda. So that's an extension of that lab's work. And this is just a further example for you of different patients that they model from their research and how people differ in terms of their networks, right? Who's in it and who influences what you do when it comes to health-seeking behavior before, during, and after some kind of event. Could be a concussion, could be an ischemic stroke. It depends upon the person, right? Another way to understand this from their research is to see that there are many ways to model patient relationships, and in this case, who arrives at hospital quicker in the context of something like stroke health in Cambridge. And these different social network diagrams you have there, right, are representative of people's networks, right, and what may constrain or assist them in getting help. So that at the top there is high constraint, at the bottom is low constraint, and then they study what are the dynamics of what got you help quicker. And counterintuitively, as I was saying, often it's somebody who doesn't know you all that well, but can recognize that something is going wrong with your physiology and gets you help quickly. Whereas somebody close might misread your condition and prevent you from receiving the help you require. And so this is the kind of study that they do there. Okay, putting this in the context of things that religious studies scholars might know better, we took some of this language from the philosophy of Charles Taylor in A Secular Age. This is a picture of your coastline here at the Pacific with some, I don't know if that graffiti is still there. This was taken probably in 22 with a nod to love. But even in Charles Taylor talks about networks as a skein of relations which link particular unique and fleshed people to each other. And that's what those images are trying to show you, a skein of relations. So what links us? And he even calls the church a network society. So religious groups can be understood as networks, right, of whatever kind. And the question is, how are those networks constituted and how do they influence how we live? So our questions, how does a strong social network marked by deep spiritual belonging impact what people do when they seek help, especially in cases of illness? This is the Dahan lab and what they special in, and there's Amr. They're celebrating their 10 years that they've been running their work. And it's now a heavily interdisciplinary lab where we deal with questions like the Surgeon General talked about, the epidemic of loneliness and isolation. And there's Ian, who's the one writing on this with Amr and myself, trying to take these concerns about belonging and loneliness that impact social behavioral health, inclusive of religious dynamics in places like Uganda, where there's a really much richer, complicated social network that influences what we do. So the reminder that religion can be a social determinant of health and ought to be on the table for us and not ignored and left out in the context of these data sets that we're getting. So what we've done is co-created language with Ugandan colleagues about identity, nature, health, and spirits for a questionnaire that's a semi-structured set of interviews across 4 locations in Uganda from Kampala to the southwest. And there are about 29 questions framed within this context that we ask, not patients, just community members right now, in order that might inform the tool that we create, which is a version for Uganda of what they do in Cambridge. It's called PersNet, a personal network survey they ask stroke patients about that we're trying to sensitize to sub-Saharan Africa. And in this context, there's a real commonality with what we might call, you could see this in certain areas all over Africa, including Cameroon. You could see this in maybe some Shinto traditions in Japan of what maybe Robin Wall Kimmerer calls the grammar of animacy. There's a life force and animism across objects that we might otherwise like disenchant in the West, that we need something of a re-enchantment, in the sense that life belongs in a spectrum and in a wider set of relationships than we usually assume in our disenchanted Western sense. And we might get a complicated social network that looks a bit more like this. This is too neat. This is just a concept map of these 4 components, but the subject in the middle is going to have different ties, different kind of relationships to these different areas. And in Uganda, we know it goes to ancestors, to your relationship to the land, your relationship to your clan and your community, and all of that impacts what you do, how you assess your health. An AI generated image for the belonging in medicine for us that we're now using as a symbol of our work in Uganda, tying together this concern for brain health and the setting of network analytics here. And I mentioned the motorcycles are important. In fact, if you don't know this, Motorcycle accidents have now outstripped infectious disease as the biggest health concern in a place like Uganda. And you see more trauma from that than you do from infectious disease. So it's a switch because of modernization and the use of these vehicles in an environment that's often quite dangerous. You could see that if you want in Queen of Katwe, if you've never seen the film, it's actually modeled there. So what we envision then is hopefully in the long term that work like this contributes to our conversation about prudential judgment and AI in medicine, so that decision-making about a patient in a place like sub-Saharan Africa can include ancestral relationships, relationship to nature, relationship to one's clan, that's much more inclusive of a wider network of belonging, that gives us a better readout, as it were, of the patient in this context of, we would hope, a good sense of, virtuous sense of the quantified self. As you know, there's already some work to solve the problem of language models in Africa. There's a dearth of information from there, and the UN Agency for Digital Technologies is calling for projects like Lelapa AI, where we're trying to integrate and understand how it is that we can ensure that languages that otherwise are being marginalized or lost can also be part of the global conversation. So we're doing our work in 2 different Bantu languages as well, that contributes to this kind of work. Again, there's that. Now you have the QR code to the piece from Scott Kellerman that gives you really from the ground vision of a physician who struggled for years to figure out how to do some of what we're talking about, to integrate his care for folks in Uganda who are marginalized and booted out of the rainforest for the sake of the gorilla, the Batwa, and to get them rights and land, but also then the problems of care in that community that involved the kinds of things we're talking about that delayed care or caused trouble in terms of the conditions under which patients arrived because of certain things that traditional practices did to patients. Another setting close by is this piece called Cutting for Stone, which is a beautiful piece written by Borghese, who's right here in the Bay Area at Stanford, actually. He has more than just this novel, but this is one of them. So if you want kind of a health humanities of medical practitioners who are helping us envision on the ground what it means to bring together these concerns for local tradition, modern medicine, religious practices, it's a beautiful meditation on that in Ethiopia, in Addis Ababa, and around the world. But he's here locally with you if you should engage him in conversation. There's our project again for you that we're working on. It's extended to 2026. It says they're 2025, but we got a no-cost extension because of how long it's taken to get the permissions from the Brigham and Uganda to do the work ethically internationally. This just was released today. If you don't know about the New England Journal of Medicine's work in AI, they actually have a whole a whole journal dedicated to AI now. And you could join this on October 9th for free if you'd like to see how it is that AI in healthcare is being thought about. It's virtual and available to all if you'd like. That's the QR code to the registration if you'd like to just see where the conversation is at this high level of practitioners from not only computer scientists, but medics and others involved in the conversation like ourselves in that 3-dimensional cube of translational science and how it is that scientists are publicly communicating what they're up to. So there's the context for our work today and what we're talking about. Prudential judgment in medicine that's perhaps complemented by this work that's being enacted by us in Uganda as we increase our access to information about how it is that people do navigate their health. So yeah, so there's plenty of time to converse in here and online if anybody would like to interact. If not, you can have a early end of the time you plan to be here and get on to what's next. So.
Hey, this is Cynthia. I'm going to jump in with a question. I also need to run to a 1 o'clock meeting, but first of all, just thank you. Thanks for your thoughts. I could probably turn my camera on and let's see why not.
That's okay. Yeah, however you like.
We're all like, yeah, anyway, I am somewhat just for my next meeting, but hey, just a quick hi. I loved and I would love to follow up for some other things. A lot of the same authors and things that you're referencing are so interesting. But I guess one quick question is, would you say a bit more? I've read a lot of Charles Taylor's work, how you've brought in some of the kind of ancestral spiritual influences and what that looks like, even in terms of like a construct. When you're looking, I was kind of looking at your spiritual, the tool, looks like there's a piece for that. Would you say a bit more about how you brought that in? That's really interesting. And then I'm going to zip out. So yeah,
quick response. So the language of buffering and prosody is strange, right? And so to the outsider, it doesn't seem obvious. But they're being used analogously. So that in what way are is the modern person closed off in a Weberian sense of disenchanted world where there are no spirits, there is no God. It's just a naturalist environment where we simply have to do the biopsychosocial measurement of the person, and that's sorted, right? So that's the buffered self. It's usually the kind of modern context that we know happens even in Uganda. You leave your rural village, you go to Kampala, and you've also been influenced deeply by that, and you lose some of that connection to what would be porous. In other words, an openness to, you know, spiritual influence, ancestors, other kind, even the way you would navigate your health with something like access to prayer or rituals. That would be the porous self. It represents that kind of, that there's more that can come into who I am, and I'm not impervious to those kinds of influences, and so maybe I'm open to that possibility, right? So we started with that idea. We thought when we went to Uganda, we'd find that represented easily, but it's much more complex, right? Because it's post-colonial. It's not like we're not going back 300 years to try to find out how people were prior to colonization. It's impossible. So what we're dealing with is a soup of post-colonial modern environments where everybody in some way, shape, or form has a complicated set of ties to spiritual traditions or slowly moving away from them, because of the constant pressure to be a participant in the global market. So capitalism and Uganda is a place where both the U.S., well, the U.S. is mostly pulled out. It's a place where some of Europe and China are fighting for the land, and land grabbing is happening. And so they feel often that the U.S. is no longer some place that they can look to, but there are different pressures of modernization happening that are influencing the relationship to the land and to ancestors we're seeing is eroding. And so it's sort of a need to capture a moment in time where there still is some complications about how it is that people integrate their spirituality into their health and their lives that may not be around that much longer in some cases. It will take a new form, but it won't take the form that it has now. So, and I guess the other thing to say about Taylor is that the disembedding, the idea that, you know, how deeply rooted you are in your community is important to our study too, right? So that's why belonging and loneliness are more important now in terms of the language we're using. And so to whom do you belong? That question is important, right? And do you belong to, like, even we asked the question, how closely do you belong to the gorilla who you live next to in the Southwest, right? And so depends who you talk to, right? We used to hunt them in some cases, so they're not really kin, but for other people, no, animal kingdom, they're kin in some way. And so, but the tension of even living close to a World Heritage Site where the gorilla are protected is complicated for folks there, right? And we found that those folks are actually migrants. So they're from all over sub-Saharan Africa in that location, whereas people in Kampala, in big city, they can talk about this down to the 7th generation because it's family land, right? And so it's just those dynamics of how deeply rooted are you in the soil and in the land and in the people to whom you belong depends upon the community and those dynamics of pressure that we're facing. So Emmanuel Katangale, a close friend of ours at Notre Dame, who is Ugandan, who runs the Bethany Land Institute, tells us that story, right? That the old tradition was you buried the umbilical cord in the soil because you belong directly to that land that connects you intergenerationally to your ancestors and even in your very body, right? So that the soil, belonging to the soil, being a bataka, right, or a mutaka matters. And so, but that's changing. And so the disembedding of Taylor, the sense of where I belong and the pressures I face, and the Weberian notion of disenchantment or re-enchantment is all part of that. Marshall Solins is the one who sort of was arguing for, before he died, re-enchantment. So there's an ongoing dialogue in sort of religion and science, depending upon which side you end up on in terms of how much of this stuff you allow in. So the UN is arguing for integrating indigenous wisdom and traditional medicine in some cases, because they know that 85% of the world still is there. But if you actually look to the recent Dean's presentation from Harvard, he says, we are here to demystify the world. So even now we have this in the global conversation from the UN and from places like leading medical institutions like Harvard, disagreement about how to go about this process of flourishing, of health. But you have to go, so stay in touch, write me.
I do. There's a lot in there. I teach and was, knew Emmanuel Katangale's work when I was at Notre Dame myself. And so anyway, a lot, I want to think about some of the things you said, but I appreciate that and we'll follow up. So thanks so much for today. I'm going to sign off.
Yeah, great to meet you.
You too.
Braden.
Yeah, could you, if you can easily, jump back to the four aspects that you're,
Yeah.
the language of the surveys?
Yes.
I'm just curious, and again, this is, not trying to direct research in any way, but is there any language about virtue? Do you think that virtue is going to continue to be relevant in the Ugandan context, or do you think that that's something that's going to change given that you're working with a traditionally Western and Christian understanding of virtue, and now in a different context? Do you think that that's how that's going to?
Yeah, it's definitely informing. And so some of our team members in Uganda. So if I could, I can share with you the other stuff if you want. But in terms of how it is blown out by the questions that make this clearer. But yeah, there are Ugandan notions of what constitutes virtue, right, that are informing our work for sure. So, yeah, I mean, it's generally within the context of the Ubuntu, which many of you know about from the South African context of that's why the language of "to whom do I belong" is important, right? That it's not the identity is always wrapped up into sociality at a larger scale that influences how you think about virtue and happiness, right? We tend to be still we're very influenced by an individualism here that's eroded. Well, it's not eroded. It's taking root in Uganda. So it depends upon who we talk to, which location they're in, how influenced they are by that, and that's helping us understand what it means to be a good person in Uganda and flourishing. So there's the tension that the good life that people receive now because of they went mobile first. They didn't do landlines, right? So immediately to mobile, access to data if you have the money, and so a quick move to seeing what the good life looks like. So many people who are in the rural areas who have access to the information at their fingertips of the world see the good life as presented in a particular way and want to move to Kampala. But the unemployment rate is massive, super high. You move to Kampala, they sell their land, they end up disenfranchised, no money, and then are on the streets, maybe riding a motorcycle, trying to make money, and that doesn't work out, right? And so they won't go back home because they're ashamed. They've broken ties with their village. They've expected to succeed in the city. They fail in the city, and they can't go back because of the shame. So in terms of the virtue, right, of belonging to a community, it's tied up also with this difficulty of how to handle reconciliation and forgiveness, or welcoming back in when the pressure to succeed is quite high for the good life, which looks like an urban bling, kind of lifestyle. So I don't know if that addresses some of your question. So, and I don't know, I realized I didn't tell the audience what you had asked, but Braden was wondering where virtue fits into these four components and how we might better think about that. So I appreciate it. Yeah, and this is ongoing. This is first the data collection, moving from there, and then we get to do the theory building. So what I didn't say is we have a whole group of philosophers also in Uganda, and theologians and priests with whom we're working on the theory in connection with the data, right? And so those folks are helping us get into the archives in Uganda to extract, in this case, two different regions, but we're starting with some material from the Baganda around Kampala, where they do have archival research on how virtue is understood, right, and how flourishing is understood. So one of our first papers is going to be a comparative study between Western flourishing and Ugandan flourishing and how they differ in particular ways, but we haven't completed that yet. So appreciate it. Let me see the chat here. Bob's asking a question, or he said, thank you. Thank you, Bob. Well, you're the founder of this, so appreciate you being here, and we owe our work to you and our capacity to be together, so appreciate it. And I didn't realize, I was telling Mark this, that I followed theology and science for so long, and I wasn't aware of the nod to the Golden Gate Bridge on the cover, and and so it's so delightful now that I've left my heart in San Francisco that I can relate to that bridge building that's on the cover of the journal itself. So appreciate it. Let's see. Oh yeah, Joy.
Yes, thank you. Excellent talk, very intriguing, and I have lots of questions, so I'm hoping you'll put your contact information in the chat. What occurred to me is a question about, is there a common understanding of what evidence-based decision-making in a healthcare context actually means.
Man, you play hardball, don't you? Joy, that's great. That's a tough question.
Sorry, I have
No,
an
that's why-
PhD and I worked in biotech for 30 plus
yeah,
years.
no, that's wonderful. I appreciate it. I guess the easiest way to answer that for you initially is I don't know if there's a singular definition of what that means or how to apply that. You're right that I'm assuming a lot when I offer the kinds of insights I'm trying to offer here, that we have a complication of too much information and an inability to crunch that well enough to do evidence-based medicine all the time. So I do know from talking to practitioners, to clinicians around the world, especially in the global north, I'd say more so than the global south in this case, that even the younger physicians entering into their profession find it hard to navigate what evidence-based medicine means with their senior colleagues. Their senior colleagues are unwilling to listen to them with stuff that they might consider to be the latest evidence. And so even within hospitals and healthcare settings, there's a disagreement amongst those practicing about how to do evidence-based medicine, because the way that certain, let's say, triage is practiced, or the way that certain procedures are done, are set in stone in some cases and can't be challenged, even though the idea is to remain open the possibility of change and shifting with the latest evidence. So I think
Thank you. That makes sense. I work with a palliative care team in a community hospital as a chaplain, and I support staff as well as patients and families. And one of the things I have heard that particular tension from multiple sides. And as you're aware, since you've been in the Bay Area, I live in Fremont. And
Yeah.
this is one of the more diverse of the areas in terms of ethnicity and religious practice and food preferences. So we find ourselves challenged constantly on how to communicate a clinical observation in terms of helping people make decisions when the contexts are so different. And I find I actually do use all of my background and training in trying to support teams as they try to help people come to a decision. That's why I'm curious how we can identify our assumptions so we know when we're testing them.
Yeah, no, wonderful. Yeah, and I think the problem too is that we can cherry pick for ourselves. We can say, well, this is the evidence, and you say, well, that's the evidence that you've read and that you like, but it's not actually the whole picture. So I do think there can be that danger too, so that it could be the case that some people want things to change on their terms, and they say they have the evidence, but it's hard to make the case given how much evidence there is out there, and some of it conflicting. So it makes it difficult to sort out the authority of one's claims, that it's this evidence that proves X, and so we should move in this way, right? So there still is that.
I like that. Which evidence and what is our authority? Because a lot of people question authority, and that contextual questioning is different depending on your background.
Yeah. So
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. And I do think the partnerships with each other in terms of examining assumptions, and then having the good challenging conversations where we're confronted to answer why it is that we rely upon a certain set of evidence is helpful for all of us, right? And so you might become aware of your own limitations and biases in that context of conversation. But I also know the time pressures under which many people practice medicine don't leave room for the kind of weighting of all the factors that you're talking about, even in Fremont, right? So, but if practitioners were empowered to be able to know what it is that makes up a particular patient's, I guess, personal, and we're moving towards personalized medicine, but personalized medicine that isn't simply pharmacological or measuring from a latest brain scan, but also integrated into health patterns, it could be really helpful.
Yes, and working as a team, I've found is important, and I think it's going to be crucial to include people with interdisciplinary training who've led, shall we say, have had a series of encounters with a so-called real world in many capacities, in order to help people address how the feelings that arise in the practitioners and in their teams trying to figure out how to best communicate a situation to a family and a patient, which is the ultimate objective of all this, is how do you understand the patient and family well enough to provide them with choices that don't overwhelm.
Yep. Yeah. And then don't come across as simply paternalistic, right? And just telling people what to do, right? So
Correct.
giving some agency back to the person and the family. And yeah, it's difficult. It's a difficult dance, but that's why I'm really Cutting for Stone is such a beautiful book. I don't know if you've read that, but it's...
I have started it. I have not finished it. It's now going back on my list. Thank
Okay,
you.
good. But I do think narratives like that really help, which is why it's been good for me to work in health humanities and narrative medicine and learn about that, including medical anthropology, just to get a
And
better...
I think that's wonderful. As someone, I also sit on an institutional review board for this local hospital, and we do complex clinical trials as part of the UCSF expanded network and it's a way of getting input from a diverse population and getting patients. And just reading through having a background in biotech and biopharmaceuticals, I appreciate the diagrams in the cancer studies and realize many of my colleagues don't realize that when you try to explain that to an ordinary person, you've just deluged them with information and they're not, and they don't even understand the little cute diagram that explains what might happen, but we won't know which arm of the 4-arm trial you're going to be in because it's randomized. And now that people are overloaded and they have 30 pages to go through, they don't know what to do. Trying to bring back, maybe somebody needs to sit and speak to them and just pay attention. This takes time.
Yeah, time is what we lack, right? Especially in the pressures of the way that compensation works for healthcare in the U.S. in most cases, right? So
and it's one of the things that I've learned, that nurses and research coordinators, if you find somebody who's gifted at that, they're worth every penny, because it keeps people on trial in a way that supports them actually getting good health care, which is crucial. So having
yeah,
what?
thank you. One area related to the topic that we're dealing with and might be relevant to the work here at the CTNS with respect to virtue and AI is I know that there have been some studies about children undergoing cancer treatment and gaming. And so actually by gaming with a game that's designed, for example, for young children, a game where you're fighting cancer cells, helps a young person undergoing cancer treatment to be better adherent to their protocols. Because then the gaming makes sense. Like there's not something I've done. There's nothing wrong with me. It's not something to punish myself for, and I'm not so frightened. I know that actually what we're doing is we're undergoing a common fight against an NPC, and so the gaming makes them go, yeah, I'll take the meds, even though I know it hurts right now. It's sort of for that end game of my health and care, and I like the context of doing an imaginative space where somebody can explore that makes sense and is actually vetted by professionals who know what they're doing. So even teamwork where you can build games together that help health and just thinking more widely together. And you here in the Bay Area, you have opportunity to do that. So
exciting field. Well, thank you. And I intend to stay in touch with you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Please do.
Great.
Yeah, it's a little tangential to what you were saying, but it ties in with another grant that we currently have through the AAAS on climate science and theological education. And it's one thing that's really come out for me from the Virtuous AI project is the unawareness we have of the environmental impact of our technological choices. So would you say that the bigger challenge to the sinking of these data farms in the ocean, is it displacement of habitat, or is it the actual increase to the temperature of the water from the operation of the data center, or is it something else?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, Braden's asking for, if you can't hear online, about another grant dealing with ecology, you said, is it? Climate science and theological education and research, and how my comment about data farms sunk in the North Sea, what's the major impact? Simply increase in temperature or ecosystem loss? I mean, it's all combined, right, in my sense, in my understanding. We know that the temperature changes are drastically affecting ecosystems and the delicate balance of life in ecology. So we need to find a way to yeah, I guess the dream is one would hope that our advances in AI can help us discover solutions for the problem that AI is presenting in terms of the amount of energy required. And we know that I actually am very conflicted myself. I'm in the conversation and belong with Mark for AI and Faith. I'm working with you on in this context. And I know that every time I use ChatGPT or DALL-E, I'm using too much water, which, as somebody who spent a long time in the Northwest and now sees the Northwest burning, is a sad reality for me, right? So I'm contributing to the conditions of deforestation and ocean warming just by my experimentation with AI for the sake of education. So not to mention, here we are using all this technology and the complication of conflict materials in the DRC, right? So that affects communities with whom I live in Uganda, right? So the ecological impact of our extractive practices and then technological creation is an ongoing problem for us. But I'm of the opinion, and I've thought about this, I'm not one who wants to dial back. Not because I'm a techno-optimist, essentially, like many have complained about Silicon Valley, but I just think that humans, maybe a la the Canticle for Leibowitz, right? We can't, even if everything got destroyed in a post-apocalyptic scene, we'd rebuild it all from a recipe, all right? It's, we want knowledge, we want to keep moving, we don't really want to just bury what we know. Even the call to pause what we're doing in AI may not help if we're not going to keep working together. So I think the image I hope for is something like that's presented in Ted Chiang's short story that was made into a film, Arrival, in 2016, of getting us somehow to work together, right, across our differences, especially in the scientific world, to share information and share data so that we can work together towards an end game that saves spaceship Earth, because it's all we got, you know. So, so yeah, I don't. That's not really an answer to your question. It's more of a statement of sympathetic work towards understanding better together how the beauty of what we're doing, even in this technology, needs to be reconciled with the lament of what it's destroying, and that we need to find a way towards what I would call maybe in the world of solar punk and Afrofuturism, a vision of building a future that's integrative and not so destructive. But anything we extract from the earth is going to do it, and so I don't think we have an easy solution yet. So.
Well, I think that's a good note to end things on. So thank you for those of us who joined us online. Thank you for those of us who are in person. Let's thank Cyrus one more time.